Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Turner with PowerPoint 2. This PowerPoint focuses on additional factors of second language acquisition, building on the information that we presented in the first PowerPoint. And we'll go ahead and jump right in. We're going to talk about the PRISM model. We're going to talk about stages of language development. And then we're going to talk about two different types of curriculum, AAA, and then communicative language classrooms, CLT. And then finally, we'll end this session with the difference between BICS and CALP and just the considerations that you have to make as a language teacher. So here we go. Just a quick note before we begin, a lot of the material that we will talk about in the TESOL certificate program is geared towards teaching both in the US and abroad. There's different considerations that you have to make for each population. Certainly here in the United States, where we have such a large diversity of immigrants and refugees and newcomers to our country, you have a different population that you would be working with in your classroom with a lot more diversity in terms of background, language, first culture, et cetera, compared to if you were teaching English in another country. So just wanted to begin with that note. Nevertheless, whatever your context is, whether it's here locally or abroad or overseas, it's still really important to consider the background of your learners and their families. So let's go ahead and get started with our focus questions. So before you begin to watch this video and complete the readings for this section of information, first reflect on these two questions that are on your reflection assignment number 2. The first one is, in the last PowerPoint, we discussed factors related to second language acquisition, including motivation, the effective filter in the classroom, and how that can affect students' learning and motivation, and then characteristics of comprehensible input, right? So making sure that the language that we're using in the classroom is accessible to our learners. Can you imagine additional factors that will play a role in your students' success in learning English as a new language? List those factors. And then number 2, what kind of language skills are needed for students to be successful in school or work, especially when English is the dominant language of the community? So specifically thinking about the context in the US. All right, so where have we come from? It's always important to know kind of the history of the fields, and we're going to give you just a snapshot of that in this course. So prior to the 1990s, you might have lived this yourself in language classrooms throughout the United States. The focus really in language classroom was grammatical knowledge, right? There was a lot of very isolated practice, fill in the blanks, translation type exercises that ultimately research has shown, and probably your own personal experience has shown, are very ineffective in terms of language acquisition, right? Now, today, though, we have luckily made a lot of progress in our beliefs and pedagogical practices for teaching language. We know that language acquisition is really achievable through meaningful, authentic communication. We often, have heterogeneous classes already alluded to. And increasingly, even in like the K-12 context, what is traditionally known as a ESL teacher or a multilingual specialist is starting to team teach with subject area teachers and pushing into the classroom rather than just pulling students out. So the PRISM model is one that is very influential in our field and one that we still reference today. And it essentially says that there are 4 components that influence both first language and second language acquisition. Remember that L1 just means first language and L2 is second language. So in our case, we also talked about it as like a new language in case it's their third or fourth language. But those 4 components include sociocultural processes, language development, academic development, and cognitive development. And so all 4 of those really contribute to the language learning, the language acquisition of learners. Right, so let's talk about each one of those in turn, beginning with sociocultural processes. This is the idea that all the experiences that the learner brings to the classroom, from the past, the present, and even considering into the future, has an impact on that student's learning. So it's really important to gauge students' background information and to tap into that into the classroom. Furthermore, there's other factors that are listed here on this slide, such as the language use at school. Is the L1 of the students, is that seen as a minority language? Is it diminished in terms of language status? Is language learning at home encouraged by teachers? So we know that it's really important that our learners, even as they're learning English as a new language, that they're continuing to build their proficiency and their knowledge of the L1. Student socioeconomic status, we know, has a large impact on learners, right? And here in the United States, immigrant minorities and also abroad are at higher risk for a lower socioeconomic status. Past schooling. It is common to encounter students who have had gaps in their formal education. Even when working with adults in community-based organizations, you will find some of your students will come and will not have had schooling for a number of years, or maybe have stopped their formal schooling, around 6th or 7th grade. The number of years, time in residence, number of years in the United States or in a English dominant speaking context will also obviously have a large impact on language acquisition. And then affective filters. So not only lowering that affective filter in the classroom, like we discussed last time, but just in general, the affective filters or the affective factors that this learner encounters. So their psychological well-being, their mental health, their socioeconomic stability, the home environment, obviously the classroom environment, their experience and perception about their L1 and their home culture in the community, that all of that influences their outlook and behavior. And then finally, societal factors. We know that schools are not immune to the societal factors that are going on around them. In fact, schools are kind of like sponges. We soak it all in. We are reflections of what's going on in the larger society. So what's going on outside your classroom certainly affects those learners and their success in your classroom. Okay, quick myth buster. I've had a lot of people say this to me. They'll tell me that they're too old to learn another language, and research shows it's not true. So young children are not the fastest learners of L2s, right? There are actually multiple sensitive periods. You might have heard of like a critical period of language learning, and that's why younger learners are better at language learning. Actually, the most recent research shows that there are multiple sensitive periods that do have effects, especially on things like pronunciation. So as an older learner, you're able to draw from your knowledge of your L1, so you can actually learn language or acquire language more quickly. But younger may be better in terms of pronunciation and obviously social language. If you think about the circumstances of our young learners that are in a K-12 classroom, surrounded by peers who are speaking to them in the language of the community, which in this case is English, there's a motivation to learn it. There's a lot of contact hours to learn it. The risks of making mistakes are quite low, and all of those factors largely disappear for adults, right? We have much less time in class. We feel a much greater reluctance to make errors in front of our peers. So there really are multiple factors, but in general, we cannot make that statement that you are too old to learn a language. You always can learn a language. It has to do with comprehensible input, low affective filter in the classroom, communicative language teaching, which we will talk about very soon. All right, you're going to encounter learners of all different stages of language development. We know that. And oftentimes they're side by side in the same class. You might have learners who are in that silent period. They are just arriving. They might look like they're not learning anything, but believe me, they are. They are acquiring language very quickly by listening and understanding. So in this type of period, you really want to be cognizant of having them demonstrate understanding by pointing, by thumbs up, thumbs down, by sorting objects, by putting pictures in order, doing things like that, but not producing language. So they're very much accepting, receptive part of language learning and not the productive side. Then we move towards early production, right? That's when language begins to emerge with a bit of production, very scaffold, meaning that it's supported by the teachers, right? They might be able to produce a limited number of words, phrases, or simple sentences. And then we have speech emergence and intermediate fluency as things begin to expand, right? And so you can see from the chart that intermediate fluency, they're starting to develop increased levels of accuracy. They're able to express thoughts and feelings. And as they move to advanced fluency, they are being able to utilize very varied grammatical structures and vocabulary, and may even be comparable to native speakers of the same age. It's important that you note that change is continuous, even from that silent reception period, pre-production, through advanced fluency. It's continuous, but it is gradual and it is slow. And probably all of you have, if you've studied a language, you have experienced the slowness that acquiring a language might be. So this requires patience, it requires repetition, and above all, it really requires good language techniques, teaching techniques, so that we're maximizing their time in the classroom to develop language. Okay, this is same information, but it comes from an organization called WIDA. These are the way that they break up levels of proficiency. This is utilized by most K-12 schools. So if you are coming from an ESL background in public elementaries or middle or high schools, you're probably more familiar with this language. And they have can-do proficiency statements of what students are able to do in each of these levels. Okay, Mythbuster, cognitive and academic development in L1 supports, does not interfere with L2 development. We know that L1 and L2 are interdependent. This is why older learners actually can acquire a new language more quickly because they draw on their knowledge of their L1. So unfortunately, a lot of teachers, well-meaning teachers, will tell families not to speak the home language at home and just to try to speak all English to maximize English learning. But this is actually very counterintuitive for students, that we need them, as we saw in that PRISM diagram a couple slides ago, we need their cognitive development continuing to grow. We need their academic development continuing to grow in the L1. Okay. Okay, so there's a couple of reflection questions for you to answer at this time, and I'll have you refer to your specific reflection assignment. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is something called the ZPD. ZPD, the zone of proximal development. This comes out of the work of Vygotsky, and he's a well-known educational philosopher. And his idea is kind of similar to what we saw in the first PowerPoint together about comprehensible input. It's like this stretching. I think about a rubber band. So if we stretch a rubber band just a little bit, it's good, it works. If we stretch a rubber band too far apart, what happens? Well, it'll snap, it'll break. Well, it's similar with our students. So if you think about children's current achievement, the zone of proximal development is like where you might stretch them to. It's that I+1. It's that little bit of stretch that we want to put on students. But if we put too much pressure on them, if we overwhelm them with a task that's way beyond their level of proficiency, we're going to snap that rubber band. We're going to snap how they're feeling about learning languages in your classroom, and they're probably going to shut down or maybe stop coming. So you really have to be careful to meet students where they're at, and not to bore them by keeping them within or even more narrow than their current proficiency, but just trying to stretch them just beyond that. Okay, you can see the quote from Vygotsky here on the left-hand side. The zone of proximal development, or ZPD, is the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. So certainly under the scaffolding of a teacher, you're able to really draw that learner a little bit further. And then I bring up this concept of funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge is a theoretical framework that is certainly part of my own research that I do here at NC State and in the World Languages and Cultures Department. because it's the idea that our learners, they come not only with prior educational knowledge or language knowledge, but they also come with what we can call the repertoires of knowledge brought from home. So this can extend beyond knowledge of language to include things like scientific knowledge from the house, family values, occupational knowledge. It might include things like car repair or um, working with animals or plants. It could be things like conserving water in the home or how to utilize flame or fire. And this comes out of the work of Lewis Mall and Norma Gonzalez. Norma Gonzalez was a teacher and Lewis Mall was an anthropologist, and they did work um, on families and the knowledge that they brought into the school that often went underlooked or undervalued. And so, along those lines, I'm going to ask you to think about funds of knowledge for your own family, the things that you bring to the classroom as a teacher or you would bring as a student. And then this should help frame up how you think about your learners. And really, the goal here is looking for assets that they bring into the classroom, knowledge and information, and ways that they might contribute to the content and conversations of your classroom. So, thinking through these different categories of your own familial funds of knowledge. Okay, I want to talk now about two different types of curriculum or kind of pedagogical approaches. The first one is known as AAA or AAA. I've heard both. Van Leer followed the work of Vygotsky, which we just learned about with the zone of proximal development. And he talked about the most important factor in teaching was to understand your learners. And I certainly agree. I think that it is the number one thing for you to know about your students, starting with their names and being able to pronounce their names correctly, knowing where they're from, then knowing their funds of knowledge, like we just discussed, knowing their current levels of proficiency and their zone of proximal development, right? So AAA stands for awareness, autonomy, and authenticity. So if you think about awareness, this is the idea that both teachers and students have to know what they're doing and why. So that means the teacher, in terms of planning, needs to have clear learning objectives, and they need to express those to the students. And so the students also need to know why it is their teacher is asking them to do particular things, the goals behind it, and to trust that process. They need to be consciously engaged, and they also need to have some metacognitive awareness, right? Metacognitive thinking about their thinking. They need to be reflecting on their learning process. They need to reflect upon what types of activities help them learn language, what types of activities don't work well for them to learn language. Where are things that they're struggling with, and where are things that they are succeeding with, right? The second A stands for autonomy, and that's just the idea that teachers and students have to have opportunities for self-regulation, motivation, and deep processing. I really like this idea, and I think it's something that we're starting to lose a bit in teaching, especially with scripted curriculum, because one of the joys of teaching is to have that autonomy, to be able to decide how you're going to structure your course in each lesson and providing opportunities to use your creativity and to use your own interests, right? Not just the interests of your students, but certainly drawing on your own interests in the classroom and really providing some rich time for learning and reflection. And then authenticity. Obviously, we need to teach and learn languages as it's used in life. And this is an idea that will be repeated in communicative language teaching, which we'll see next. Um, so, so often, language learning and authentic language use are divorced from one another, are completely separated, right? Think about those fill in the blanks of verb conjugations. That is not how we use language. So language, as we're going to see in a moment, really should be used to express things that are personal and that are authentic to ourselves. So our preferences, our likes and our dislikes, our experiences with things, our having a say in what we learn, things that we discuss, topics that we study together. Okay, so that's the AAA curriculum. And then the one after that, this is the bread and butter of all my teaching at NC State is communicative language teaching, CLT. And this is also the goal for you in this course. Over this course and the following course, you're going to be asked to create a lesson plan that embodies CLT, that demonstrates CLT. And to do that during our micro teaching, during our workshop together, you'll do a micro teaching. And so what is CLT? So this is the leading framework curriculum about language learning today. And unfortunately, it's not used everywhere. It might even be unfamiliar to you as you go into your internships. You might not be seeing this happen in classrooms, but it really should be. All the research points to the benefits of this type of teaching and learning. So it's the idea that language learning needs to be authentic and that it really needs to be centered on the learners communicating personal ideas and experiences from themselves. It also has to include negotiation of meaning. So what does that mean? This is the idea that language is not just I speak and nobody's listening. You hope that there's a listener somewhere listening and making sense of what you're saying. And when they don't understand you, they say, huh? Or they give you this look like, what? And then as the speaker, you have to reformulate what you're trying to say, maybe try to come up with a different way of saying it, or change a verb, or make some kind of minor adjustment so that that listener can understand you. So it's very much a negotiation of understanding between the speaker and the listener. Even when you're talking to yourself or you're journaling to yourself, the idea is that there is a viewer, there is a listener to that speech. But in our classroom, we want to have as many opportunities as possible for students to work together in pairs and small groups, right? Very small groups, maybe 3, no more than 4 ever, right? Because learners can get lost in big groups. So that's the goal, having to communicate personal ideas and experiences, always thinking about how can I get my learners to talk about their own experiences, just thinking about like their preferences on colors, on foods, on schedules, on sports, on hobbies, on debate topics, weather, seasons, trips. I mean, everything in language classrooms is geared around what do the learners think about those things and having them express those ideas. All right. So I ask you to take a moment to reflect and answer your reflection questions. And then the last topic for this section of information that I want you to consider as a language teacher, and this might be new for you, thinking about, might be something you've never really thought about. Jim Cummins, who is also a big name in language acquisition, especially second language acquisition, came up with these 2 terms. One is BICS, or Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, and the second one is CALP, or Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. And those are fancy terms to talk about social language, like BICS would be things like saying, hey, how's it going? Checking in with people, asking about their day-to-day, events, checking in on their health, or, talking about the weather. It's like that language for everyday living, okay? Very informal interactions. CALP, as the name suggests, with academic, is really the language that's used to be academically successful and to talk about content as you would think about content from other subjects. All right. The difference between BICS and CALP, you can see with the iceberg, is like on top, BICS is much smaller. CALP is a bigger base, okay? BICS can be developed by learners relatively quickly, right? As it says here on the slide, they usually develop these skills develop within 6 months to 2 years after arrival in the US or full immersion in the language, okay? Oftentimes, students will have very high BICS and the teacher assumes, well, they must have lots of language and, they don't understand why they're not successful in their other classes. Well, that is likely because their CALP has not developed. So as language teachers, the implications for us is yes, we have to work on BICS, but we also really need to work on developing students' CALP, especially if they're looking for jobs or they're trying to pass a graduation test or certainly if they're in, K-12 schooling or college, right? So just to go over KELP, it includes language skills used in academic content areas, including, of course, the 4 skills: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. This language has very specific vocabulary. It also has complex structure in terms of the grammar. And it's also very context reduced, meaning that it has a higher cognitive demand because there's not as many contextual clues to understand what people are talking about. Whereas BICS is it's more concrete language. Okay, KELP, you might be surprised to see this, with full immersion, usually develops within 5 to 7 years. That's a long time. And that's full immersion. So those are learners who come here and are in a K-12 school, let's say, 5 to 7 years to really develop their KELP. That's why continuing to build students L1 is so important, because they should be reading and learning about content in their L1 and having conversations about that at home with their parents and with their loved ones. Okay, so there's a reflection about BICS and KELP that I want you to take some time to do. And then just to summarize, there's a lot of promising practices. And the good news is research is moving away from those boring worksheets, very decontextualized, inauthentic language practice that you might have experienced as a learner and probably did not remember much from, except that you didn't enjoy it. So we're really moving towards theme-based learning experience, using collaboration in the classroom and cooperative inquiry or problem solving. We're moving towards Bloom's taxonomy, if you've heard that term before, moving towards the HOTS, higher order thinking skills in our learning objectives, getting students to create with language rather than just demonstrate understanding or knowledge. And then as technology and access to tools continues to grow and change, we are also utilizing those in our classrooms. Okay, the last couple of slides have to do with the work in K-12 classrooms. And so I'll leave those slides for you to review, but it is not as important for our context, especially because a lot of you might be teaching English in context outside the United States. But of course, if it's something that you're interested in learning more about, go over these slides and then also, feel free to reach out to me if you have additional questions about that. All right, perfect. So I will pause here and we will look forward to receiving your reflection questions and your discussion forum posts and responses, and we'll see you on the next content slides. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.